Hello, my friends. This is part 2 in a series of videos on a prediction of what's going to happen in the war in Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. I'm making this video and the previous one in the series on April 16. The war has been ongoing for almost 2 months now. And in the first video in the series, we focused on the details of what was happening during other invasions of Western countries. We looked at the beginning of World War II. We looked at 9/11/2001, and we're looking at February 24th, 2022. And now what we're looking at are the long-term trends. So we looked at the short-term trends over 1 or 2 years. Now here's the big picture over a long term. And at the end of the previous video, I showed this graph from 1990 to 2030, a 40-year time period, and it shows a increase in anti-American sentiment from about 1996 to 2018. That is the time period of the war on terror, the exact time period given at this website that I mentioned at the bottom of this slide at history.com. Okay, now let's look at some other 40-year time periods. Okay, that's 1990 to 2030. Let's look at the previous 40 years. What was happening in anti-American sentiment from 1940 to 1990? 1950. 1950 to 1990 is another 40 years. So on the top of this slide is a graph of anti-American sentiment from 1950 to 1990, and below it is the graph we just looked at on the previous slide. I just made it a little narrower so I could fit both of these graphs on one slide. And again, in the graph at the bottom, we see that huge wave of anti-American sentiment that happened during the war on terror. Is there a similar wave of huge anti-American sentiment between 1950 and 1990? No, there is not. These peaks are not as wide as the ones below. When we look below, these peaks, these times of anti-American sentiment, occupy over half of the time period. They're just a huge emphasis. Here there is a greater density of short peaks. So we're seeing a greater density of short peaks of anti-American sentiment from 1960 to 1975. And then more spread out after 1975. What that means is from about 1975 all the way up to about 1995, so roughly 20 years, American sentiment is low. This is the time of American prosperity in the 80s and Western style development. So there's little resistance, and then we run in, probably not expecting it. By the late 90s, we're now engaged in a war on terror and a resurgence of extremely conservative, traditional cultural values that go back hundreds and even thousands of years in their tradition. So from 1960 to 1975, there is a little bit of increased anti-American sentiment, but nothing like later on in the War of Terror. And this is the time period of the 60s, of the counterculture, of questioning American values, increasing a little bit, but not to the point of becoming reactionary, we might say. And there are other reasons for the 60s. There's a whole other graph of rebellion, of restlessness. It's not part of this video because it's not directly related to the Ukraine war. What we're looking at is time periods of we could call reactionary traditional development, and next we're going to look at pro-American exceptionalism. You know how Americans often feel like they're exceptional, like almost like they're better than everybody else, and they have the ego. I say they. I'm an American myself. The ego and this sense of being the most free, the most daring country. And that's an American pro sentiment, so we're going to look at that as well. But this rebellious quality is neither anti-American or pro-American. It's basically a kind of well, it is anti-tradition to some extent. But anyway, it's a whole different thing we're not going to get into that also affected the 60s. Bottom line is, we don't see a huge reactionary development happening from 1950 to 1990. Let's go back another 40 years. Now we have three graphs. The top graph, 1910 to 1950. That's 40 years. Middle graph, 1950 to 1990. Last graph, 1990 to 2030. We've already looked at these bottom two graphs. Let's look at the top graph. Do we see a long time period of anti-American sentiment? It stands out conspicuously. 1935, approximately, to 1943. Right in here, 1935 to 1943, right in that time period. Huge anti-Western sentiment, huge desire to go back to the old ways without all this free-spirited and independent, wild, immoral activities. The Nazi movement had been building through the late 1930s very intensely as this desire to get back to a more conservative, a less sexually explicit way of living, of having people dress more conservatively, especially women, skepticism about gay and lesbian activity, for example, which now in the year 2022 has become much more accepted and understood. But back in the 1940s, people did not understand it. They were not supportive. They didn't appreciate the range of potential ways people can be. They just had sort of one way. This is how life was made. This older, more restrictive way of thinking was a big motivation for the development of the Nazi movement as they fought the liberal wild changes that were happening. And there we have a circle drawn for when Germany invades Poland, right in this time period. And what's also interesting, by 1943, the Allies, the West, England and United States and so on, begin to turn the tide. By 1945, win the war as the anti-Western sentiment dies out. Times perfectly. There's also a huge wave of anti-American sentiment in 1912, 1913, right around 1912. I didn't explore that, and I don't know what was going on then. I'm not a historian, by the way. Another little blip here. So those are time periods when these things develop as well. Now, we're going to learn that this vibration, this astrological vibration, it's really not anti-American. It's not like there's something up in the sky that says, we don't like America. It's a kind of energy flow that America tends not to understand and appreciate. Just like an individual can understand and appreciate certain things, not be able to understand and appreciate other things, countries are the same way. And we see that the United States and countries that are similar to the United States understand and appreciate certain things and are not very good at understanding some other things and appreciating them. We'll look at that in more detail later. Okay, and by the way, we can zoom in again to the 1934. Let's see, this is January 1st, 1944 to 1944. This is a 10-year period, and we see that when Germany invades Poland, not only is it during this 10-year period of anti-American sentiment, but it occurs at one of the peaks. Right on this little peak, that particular day, the feeling is very strong, and the call is made and people go. People will start. They will actually do it. When that energy reaches a peak, they will take that action. They've planned for a long time, and then when that day comes and everything feels right, the go signal is sent and it happens. So you will often see that these actions take place during a longer trend. Here we see for a 10-year trend. Actually, it's less than 10 years because it doesn't really start up until about 1935. But to use round numbers, I took a 10-year time period. So there's the long trend, and within that long trend, a spike when the invasion occurs. Let me read what I have here because it helps appreciate and understand what exactly this anti-American sentiment is. The 10 years from January 1st, 1934 to January 1st, 1944 are shown in the graph. The building up of anti-American sentiment grows preceding World War II. This is very well documented by historians. The development of anti-Western and pro-Nazi feelings in the last half of the 1930s. These periods of anti-American sentiment are times when many people seek the ways of their ancestors. That's an important thing. Why are they anti-Western? Well, one part of it is they want to get back to the ways of their ancestors. They don't want to forget those traditions. They don't want to leave them behind. They feel that there's something sacred, something deep and profound in that history that we can't even completely understand. We should not just wipe it away. And we need to become quieter, more respectful, more conservative. This is what this wave of feelings is about. And those countries where a large number of people are attuned to this vibration of connecting back with the ancestors, keeping those ancient traditions, they feel emboldened. They feel inspired. They feel like their time has come to resist the tearing down of these ancient traditions and rituals. So along with this, there is skepticism about the wild new ways and innovations that the West brings. There is concern about the lack of morality, the lack of focus, the lack of perseverance, and there is a concern that people are losing their ability to patiently work through difficult times. So this anti-American sentiment is also triggered by the feeling that the West wants quick answers, excitement, wild spontaneity. They want to just take, a drug to fix their problems. They have quick, fast, somewhat superficial answers to things from that point of view. So quick answers, excitement, wild spontaneity, and the brashness, pride, and lack of humility are more distasteful than usual to many people during these time periods. There is a tendency to have reactionary movements that embrace old themes, and you can get themes like denying basic rights for women. Things that I hope all of us watching this video understand are very dysfunctional, very unhealthy, and very destructive. So with any energy, there are positive potentials and negative potentials. But this desire to go back into the deep ancient way brings with it some of the restrictions, harshness, and dysfunctional stopping of people's potential. People can also feel a religious fervor for ancient rituals and ancient ways, even if some of them are archaic and destructive from our modern point of view. So this is what happens. Any energy can be positive or negative. This particular vibration very easily and quickly becomes very negative and dysfunctional, and that's what happens. It's not all bad, though. There's a saying, you need to understand your enemy, and I'm hoping that this kind of information would help people in their development of policies and strategies, because we don't seem to understand really why these things are happening. Okay, some additional points. The formula that is used to produce these graphs. So far, all I've done is shown you the formula. The formula is very simple. I'm going to show you the formula. It's very simple, number one. That's critically important. In data science, we know that you can create a formula to fit anything. You can make graphs that peak at those times. It can be done. But you can be fooling the people that are watching it by making every little variable that fits with those circumstances in your formula. You just put them all in there. A technical term we use for this is overfitting. You can overfit your model. It's very, very easy to do. I did not do that. This is not a model where we throw in any old variable that happened to occur. It's very simple, very elegant, very uniform, and what we call internally consistent. And second thing is the variables involved, these astrological things, these aspects that are the anti-American formula, the formula for this anti-American sentiment. It's based on our theory. It agrees with our theory. It's not some wild new idea. We have known for decades that this vibration inclines towards these kinds of results. So, again, this vibrational astrology that we're using here is a modern evidence-based practice. I don't know of any other form of astrology that's similar in using extensive data visualization, statistical analysis, measuring effect sizes, all of these things very carefully and very in depth to come up with conclusions. They can do it if they want to, but it doesn't appear that people have taken the time and effort and have the training to do it. It's being done in vibrational astrology. Some people have recommended that we don't call vibrational astrology. We should go back to using the term cosmobiology, because the argument is what we're doing is more like what's done in academia than what's done in the world of astrology. Whatever you want to call it, that's what we're doing. For now, we're calling it vibrational astrology. Number two, if the model makes an accurate prediction, it increases our confidence in the model. So, as I stated in the first video in this series, the model predicts that if the war continues until September of this year, September 2022, we don't know if it will or not, but if it does, there's going to be a resurgence from Russia. They'll probably get the support of other countries. They're going to probably claim regions of eastern Ukraine as their own. September and October are going to be very difficult for the Ukraine and the West if the war continues that long. So if that prediction is right, we have more confidence in our model. If the prediction is false, then we need to adjust our model. There's something wrong with the model. So just like weather forecasting, the model is usually correct. It is not always correct. If the war continues until September and October, and Russia does not have increased strength in this war and get support and do all these things I've described, that does not mean that all of vibrational astrology is nonsense or is ridiculous. It means that this particular model has some major flaws in it, and we need to correct it. So vibrational astrology is a new field. It is showing extraordinary ability to predict things, and we'll see if it works in this case. Most of our work in vibrational astrology is not in political affairs, not in mundane activities. We've done quite a bit with it, but we've done more with individual behavior, and we have greater confidence in those areas. So I just want to mention that. We'll see what happens. But certainly if the forecast does not work, there's some major problems with our model. and we might have to just throw the whole model out, and that will increase our feeling that we need to just focus on individual behavior. Individual behavior is where vibrational astrology really shines. Incredibly good. But there are political events, there are wars, there are elections where we want to know about them, so we try to apply the model to those situations, and we'll see how well it does. Point number 3, there are ways to defuse the potential of these astrological influences. There are policies and strategies that can, number 1, help bring an end to the Ukraine war and other conflicts. We're confident that from our vibrational astrology, we can develop better strategies, better policies to help any situation work better. And over again, we see mistakes that politicians are making because they don't have a diagnostic tool to tell them some of these things. Number 2, we can help prevent these problems. These astrological configurations, as I've said before, they indicate energetic processes with likely outcomes based on how they have been managed in the past. There is no, quote, anti-Western sentiment, unquote, in the stars. There's an energetic dynamics that in the past 100 years we've typically seen have led to particular outcomes, one of which is anti-Western sentiment. Hopefully the day will come when the United States and other allies of the United States and other democracies will better handle the situations, develop a greater understanding towards these cultures, work with them more effectively using the kind of understanding that we have from vibrational astrology, but one way or another, hopefully they develop that understanding, and that will prevent this from happening in the future. Now, the anti-West and anti-American sentiment forecast that I've shown you, it's very simple. And as I mentioned, there are other astrological predictors that have been researched and influence world events, and one of them is the pro-American forecast. So we have an anti-American forecast and a pro-American forecast. And I think I will start the third slide. I'll start the third video in a series here, because we're going to go on to a new topic, which is a pro-American forecast. Very cool. So there's an anti-American forecast and a pro-American forecast. And it's not always the case that as anti-American forecast goes down, pro-American goes up. They are two different astrological vibrations. They tend to not, well, I shouldn't even say that. They sometimes alternate rapidly between them. Some periods are very anti-American, some are very pro-American, some have a mixture of both. Let's look at the pro-American forecast and see what it tells us about the previous military actions against the Western-style life and what it tells us about the Ukraine war. Okay, that's it for the second in this series of videos. Thank you very, very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.